I now would like to introduce Misha Maitreyi. Misha is a PhD graduate student in sociology at the University of New Brunswick, and I'd like to welcome her and look forward to her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As already mentioned, I am Misha Maitreyi, PhD student at the Department of Sociology at University of New Brunswick. And Dr. Cathy Holtmann and I have worked on analyzing CDHPI data on immigrants and refugees to understand immigrant pre-migration trauma and post-migration stress as possible factors for IPV in immigrant and refugee populations. So using these three research questions, we aimed at exploring, what through the data on immigrants and refugees about pre-migration trauma and shame and honor. So these questions are service providers aware of the impacts of pre-migration trauma on immigrant women's experiences of domestic violence? Do service providers believe that there exist notions of shame and honor among the immigrant families that are affecting their lives in Canada? Is there evidence that shame and honor are being triggered as pre-migration trauma among immigrant families due to the structural barriers they are facing in Canada in the form of post-migration stress? So the theoretical framework that we have used for our analysis is intersectionality. We are looking into the role of major social structures such as ethnicity, class, gender that heighten community level risk factors for the immigrant and refugee families experiencing IPV in Canada. Within this framework, we analyze the key informant data, looking for ways in which public service providers are aware of community level risk factors associated with the cultural and religious identities and practices of immigrant and refugees. Culture and religion are closely intertwined, and together structures of ethnicity, class, gender in countries of origin and in Canada need to be explored. Cultural and religious resources shape immigrant conceptions of violence and practices of shame and honor in situations of violence, whether that violence is collective, that is in the form of wars, extremist violence, genocides, or interpersonal, that is IPV. Failing to consider and understand religious and cultural conceptions of shame and honor, or dismissing them as problematic, can be a way by which public service providers fail to address community level risk and prevent immigrants from accessing important religious and cultural resources that can help in community level safety planning. So we included all the interviews which discussed about the immigrants and refugees in varying degrees, and we used en vivo to code it. Some are inclusive of service providers also talking about immigrant children. We found evidence of how intersecting structural inequalities increased community level risk in the form of cultural barriers, language barriers, and isolation of various kinds, that is fear of isolation from their own families, communities, and losing children, fear of deportation, and also fear from the police, among many others. To understand how service providers are aware of community level risk factors associated with the cultural and religious identities and practices, they get answered from looking into these different structural barriers and how they are deeply interlinked. Our focus through this data analysis has been to look into pre-migration trauma, specifically playing a possible role in the form of post-migration stress, which we will be discussing in the next few slides. So how we are understanding pre-migration trauma is not just as collective violence that they have faced in their country of origin. Rather, it is also their experience with the socio-political institutions and structures of that country. So fear of police, mistrust of the systems in Canada, that is what we mean by that is governments and judiciary and other institutions, that highlight that it existed because of the immigrants and refugees' experiences in their country of origin. And family violence and collective violence existed in their country of origin, but it transformed into a post-migration stressor, and this leads to a change in power dynamics at interpersonal and larger socio-political level. We have not analyzed this aspect for the purpose of this research, but we feel it is essential to recognize the larger context as well. Another important barrier that emerged was post-traumatic stress disorder. So trauma of different kinds, that is from moving from a war-ridden country or going through the process of immigration, losing economic and social status. The latter can be in the country of origin and also when they move here. So certainly there is a sense of loss of identity on various fronts that can lead to perpetration of violence. Although not much was explored by the service providers in the sense what kind of PTSD emerging due to what reasons, but what came forward more or less was that immigrants and refugees are suffering from varying types of PTSD, which is also worsened by alcohol and drug consumption that is contributing to IPV. So the forthcoming slides are about mostly quotes taken from the interviews, and they discuss how service providers have discussed the role of culture and differing cultures as a significant reason behind IPV in direct and indirect ways. So it is not that on all the interviews they are saying that culture is the reason, but indirectly a lot of them are bringing forth cultural barriers as reasons behind IPV. But it is also important to understand that IPV is not, if we look into culture as the reason, it is also prevalent in the Canadian society as well. So just saying culture is a reason becomes problematic. So the first quote mentions working around cultural beliefs rather than working with, which reflects culture as something to be avoided or sidestepped. We argue that culture and religion do not cause IPV, but rather shape the experiences of IPV for survivors and perpetrators. In order to understand their experiences, service providers need to ask questions that uncover the ethno-religious beliefs and practices from the country of origin, and not just seeing culture as problematic. The second quote talks about trauma bonding, and it is very important because it reflects on different layers of trauma that are affecting the population, that is being in refugee camps or fleeing war-torn countries. So even when violence is perpetrated by the partner, they choose to stay with them because of the different types of trauma they have gone through together or they're still going through, making it very difficult to leave the abuser. Added to that is that there are other post-migration stressors playing a role. So there is a possibility of seeing IPV as not that big of a factor when things are happening in the background, such as settling in a new country, finding financial stability, etc. Along with language barriers is also creating that kind of a big factor, making them wanting to be with the abuser. Therefore, once the cultural beliefs and practices are understood in a more deeper way, along with trauma and different kinds of trauma, one can understand why reporting violence and women not coming out and reporting it is a big issue becomes difficult. Why it becomes difficult for them. What is positive is that some of the service providers have also mentioned the importance of understanding immigrants and refugees' country of origin's culture, but they recognize, while they recognize the importance of educating themselves, they mentioned that the lack of resources prevent them from learning about the culture. So our argument is that to understand different cultures and its potential role in IPV and explore community level risk and safety factors, it also becomes important to look into the economic, religious, cultural, and social factors that are at interplay and creating a sense of isolation on all fronts. And here it reflects on the question we have asked about shame and honor. So in this quote, you can see, even without the support, taking a step to separate from a violent partner brings shame to the survivor because of the cultural norms and expectations. But it is also important, and we argue that we have to broaden the notions of shame and honor. For example, some service providers discussed how the immigrants thought that moving to Canada would be a kind of economic and social upliftment. But because they are no longer doctors or engineers here like they were in the country of origin, the impact on their social and economic position leads to shame. Another kind of shame is through collectivist values, where the women decide not to report the violence because they are not seeing it as a public social problem. And since the communities are smaller in Canada, they don't want others to know about it, including religious leaders like priests and imams, etc. Additionally, there is also fear of ostracization from family members and also from their closed communities. There's also how religion is used in a negative way. So the woman's feeling of shame and guilt may be attributed to her belief in sacred duties as a mother and caregiver in her family. Many religious women believe that IPV is their fault because because if they were a better Christian mother, these problems would not have occurred. This belief is then reinforced by their abuser and the ethno-religious groups. For Muslims, sometimes understandings of gendered religious scripts of a wife's obedience and submission to the authority of her husband are manipulated to justify abuse in defense of a family's honor. And both of these examples show how religious beliefs and practices make immigrant women vulnerable to IPV. However, both Christianity and Islam have teachings and practices that promote justice, peace, and equality in gender relations, as well as sacred texts that explicitly condemn violence and abuse. Therefore, to understand how culture is playing a role, it is important to locate it alongside the different varying notions of shame and honor to understand how they are being used in a negative way, restricting immigrant and refugee women to come forward and report violence. Lastly, service providers have discussed culture, shame, honor as reasons, but they understand the importance of how these are connected. But if they understand how these are connected, this did not come in the analysis of the interviews. So blaming culture, they have blamed culture, but blaming culture is futile without an understanding of what particular cultural or religious beliefs and practices are informing a survivor's or perpetrator's worldview. So service providers are familiar with Canadian cultural norms that identify and condemn IPV. However, the Canadian cultural landscape is quite diverse. So this quote implies an even playing field when it comes to interventions for survivors of abuse, but we know that this is not the case. Ethno-religious and socioeconomic differences result in complex inequalities and require culturally sensitive and culturally informed interventions. In addition to service providers becoming more aware and knowledgeable about community-level risk factors associated with religion and culture, they also need to learn skills to assist survivors in reflecting on their ethno-religious beliefs and practices. Service providers can learn these skills from religious and cultural leaders who are trained in best practices of responding to situations of IPV. Lastly, while intersectionality as a theoretical approach helps us recognize how different oppressive systems work together, it is also important to know how it is communicated. And in some cases, there were a lot of interviews had this tone that the service providers have to explain that this is not, IPV is not tolerable in Canada and it might work back home. It is important, this is important to communicate, but it is also important to note that a tone of superiority can do a lot of damage to an already traumatized community. So in this regard, an empathetic approach is needed to be developed alongside awareness about different cultures. It's really rushed, but I'm looking forward to more questions and discussion on this. Thank you so much.